where I'll also serve as a director of special program for Eurasian Studies countries. We would like to acknowledge that we run this program in partnership with and generous support from the Nippon Foundation. For those who miss our previous talks or want to revisit our talks, I'd like to invite you to visit our YouTube channel, where all the talks are going to be uploaded as soon as we complete the online session. Before I introduce our speaker for today, let me remind you that our talks are recorded and uploaded. The talk time is around 40 to 45 minutes, followed by the questions and answers from the floor. If you wish to ask a question, please either raise your hand and ask your question directly, or leave the question in the chat box, which I will then read out. So let me introduce our speaker for today. It is a special pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Mariam Bibilashvili, who is going to deliver our talk, the talk today on her forthcoming book from Palgrave, titled Towards the Normal State, Georgian Foreign Policy Between Russia and the West. The topic received special prominence and importance in light of recent Russian campaign in Ukraine. We're happy that Mariam actually could foresee how this topic would rise in its importance and academic attractiveness back in 2018 when she started her research. Dr. Mariam Bibilashvili is currently a research associate at the special program for Eurasian countries at the University of Tsukuba. Prior to coming to Tsukuba for her MA and PhD degrees, Mariam received her BA in International Relations from the Free University of Tbilisi. After receiving her MA degree with us, she has then defended her PhD thesis on the Georgian foreign policy at the University of Tsukuba in 2021. She presented her research extensively on various topics at different conferences. Her article on the Japanese foreign policy towards South Caucasus was featured in the Asia-Europe Journal in 2021. As mentioned, her PhD thesis will come out as her monographic volume from Palgrave Macmillan this coming autumn, we hope. So without further ado, I would like to pass the floor to Mariam to present her findings, and then we will engage her into the questions and answers. Mariam, the floor is yours. Your mic is off.
Sorry. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming here today and for being interested in my talk. As Professor has mentioned, the title of my book that will come out probably by the end of this year is Towards the Normal State, Georgian Foreign Policy Between Russia and the West. And this work is based on the dissertation that I submitted to the University of Tsukuba last year around this time. So the book...
sorry, Mariam, can you speak a bit louder? Thank you.
I will try, yes. So the book itself consists of 7 chapters. It starts with introduction, then it's followed by the chapter called Georgian Foreign Policy in the Academic Discourse, which basically works as a literature review and intends to set the scene for this research. Chapter 3 is devoted to introducing the theoretical lens for this study, which is post-colonialism. And in order to do so, I cover topics such as defining colonialism and post-colonialism, as well as justifying its applicability to the post-Soviet space, and finally, how it can be applied to the study of international relations. After introducing the theoretical framework, we have chapter 4, called Ambivalent State of Mind, and this chapter is basically introducing or portraying the portrait of Georgian society, which is in an ambivalent state of understanding or negotiating their past, and we see how hybrid is the commemoration and how hybrid is what people and government remembers and forgets about their common past. And then finally, chapter 5 and 6 is directly answering research questions, followed by chapter 7, which is conclusion, with some implications and limitations of this work. So to introduce my topic, I have to mention that this study particularly looks at the Georgia, Russia, the West triangle in the foreign policy discourse of Georgia. And here the West is defined as Europe and the USA together with the Euro-Atlantic institutions such as the European Union and the NATO. And we have to say that this concept is very often referred to in a nationalistic context by various different political leaders, and thus it's one of the most commonly referred term in Georgian political discourse. As for the coverage of this study, even though the topic is much more relevant right now, considering the ongoing events in the Eastern Europe and Ukraine's invasion, unfortunately, it was started in 2018 and I was limited by the fact that I had to submit this work by the end of 2021. So the coverage is from 1991 to 2020. 1991 here refers to the time when Georgia became independent from the Soviet Union, and 2022, October 2022, signifies the the end of the second parliamentary mandate of the present ruling party, which is Georgian Dream. And plus, this particular parliamentary elections was based on the new system, and it kind of promised more diversity in the parliament. And I thought that it potentially symbolized a different era. That's why I chose this time frame. So when we talk about Georgian foreign policy, we have to consider that Georgia chose to develop a bold foreign policy vector towards the West. And this was done even at the expense of deteriorating its relations with Russia. And such a decision culminated in Russo-Georgian War in 2008. And this war shook Georgia's economy, made limitations of Western commitment towards Georgia clear. As some of the scholars have argued, none of the Western European states nor the United States bothered to strain their relations with Russia, let alone come to Georgia's military aid after the war of 2008. And even their financial aid was more of a guilt money rather than adequate assistance. So considering such an approach from the West, why Georgia continuously compromises its economy, political stability, and international ties with actors finding cooperation with Russia profitable, and by doing so, it neglects the common Russo-Georgian security interest over the North Caucasus, somehow remains to be a puzzle. We can say that there is a dualistic image in Georgian foreign policy where the West always dominates Russia, and such an approach makes Georgian foreign policy an oddity in the context of the post-Soviet space. Georgian foreign policy looks even more intriguing considering the fragmented public opinion and pro-Russian sentiments that are deeply rooted in the memory of post-Soviet Georgian society, and finally, the reluctance of the Euro-Atlantic institutions to broaden their borders, and therefore the lack of tangible benefits for ordinary citizens make the case of pro-Western orientation even more puzzling, especially in light of Brexit, when the Euroscepticism is growing within the member states themselves, and nationalistic political leaders more and more frequently lobby for less dependency. And right now we can even say that after the events that unfolded in Ukraine, three countries, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, they applied for the candidate status, and Georgia was the only one that didn't get this status. So considering all of that, why Georgia persistently follows this pro-Western foreign policy is somehow puzzling in terms of the field of international relations. Also, there is a research gap in the literature which deals with Georgian foreign policy, where positivist arguments offer an ahistorical reading and they cannot explain changes under unchanged geopolitical conditions, while constructivist arguments take the supremacy of certain norms, ideas, and identities as given, and they don't question the normalization process of these norms. Therefore, existing literature neglects the role of masses and the interaction between elite and masses in process of foreign policy making. Coming from this research gap, I designed a project where my focus was Georgia, Russia, the West Triangle in Georgian foreign policy discourse, and I followed two research questions. First of all, I wanted to know how has the foreign policy of Georgia transitioned through different leaderships, and then what discursive strategies have been employed to justify their foreign policy choices. This research had two objectives. It wanted to examine the evolution of understandings of the self and the others, as well as positioning of the self vis-a-vis the others. And it wanted to examine the ideological underpinnings representing the positive self and Western other, as opposed to negative Russian other in Georgian foreign policy discourse. In order to answer my research questions, I tried to gather three genres of documents. First of all, there are official foreign policy documents, and then speeches of high-level officials made at the national level as well as at the international level. And I analyzed those documents using discourse historical approach, which I will talk about a bit later. And finally, all of this was done guided by post-colonial critique as a theoretical framework. To talk about the methodology in a bit more detail, the data was based on documents, as I have said. In critical tradition, documents are considered as an object of research, as they can project the issues of power and ideology and illustrate the relationship between documents and the society where it has been produced. So since I was doing the longitudinal research, documents were chosen to be the best fit for this type of particular project because they are efficient, available, cost-effective, and they provide stable and exact information, which is free from reactivity and obtrusiveness. And those three types of documents cover four leaderships of the country since 1991. Together with the documents, of course, international affairs and political processes were also taken into consideration to observe the relationship between discourse on the one hand and its following actions on the other. As for the analysis, as I have mentioned, I use discourse historical approach, which is a strand of critical discourse analysis, and it takes roots from the critical theory. There are four main strands for this particular methodology. Which is its interdisciplinarity, principle of triangulation, historical perspective, as well as practical application. And the effectiveness or efficiency of DHA comes from the fact that it is a tool to discern the main features of the discursive structures in texts and analyze changes within them over time according to selected issues and various cultural or political drivers. The system of analysis that this method relies on consists of three steps. First of all, researchers should contextualize the data in a broader historical context. Then three-dimensional critique takes place, which consists of contents or topics of a specific discourse, then discursive strategies, as well as linguistic means, which are referred to as types, and linguistic realizations, tokens, used to realize those strategies. And finally, we have the step where a researcher interprets his or her findings, and interpretation of results is done considering context knowledge as well as three-dimensional critique, and then application of results is done. There are five main discursive strategies that can be employed in the discourse construction. First one is nomination, or how persons, objects, phenomena, events, processes, and actions are named and referred linguistically. Then there is predication, which measures what characteristics, qualities, and features are attributed to social actors, objects, phenomena, events, and processes. Then argumentation strategy, which measures what arguments are employed in the discourse in question. Perspectivization, from what perspective are these nominations, attributions, and arguments expressed. And finally, intensification or mitigation. Are the respective utterances articulated overtly? Are they intensified or mitigated? So based on those questions, I analyzed my data, and now I will move on to the second chapter, which is literature review, as I have said. And literature review chapter consists of three main parts. First of all, I deal with the main debates around the definition of small state, and then how small state is seen and understood from the perspective of international relations scholarship. And this was done due to the fact that most of the scholars of Georgian foreign policy, they take the concept of small state, and almost every article or the book that I read about Georgian foreign policy was done by following the idea that Georgia is a small state, and therefore there are certain limitations about the maneuverability of its leadership. And then I specifically reviewed the literature, English language and Georgian language literature about Georgian foreign policy, and found out that there are two main stances. First one taking realist position, and then second one constructivist position with a little bit of liberal insights. So if we talk about small states, there are two main issues. First of all, it's very difficult to define smallness, and then what kind of foreign policy is employed by a small state. This is also part of the discussion. So when defining smallness, we have two groups of scholars. First one that are called theorists. They try to come up with a universal or generalizable definition. And we have several points of view. First group of scholars, they try to approach this issue as I know one when I see one, so case by case. Then we have the most common approach, which is a quantitative approach, measuring smallness by the size of a population or land or GDP or different characteristics. Then we have perceptual approach, which takes the stand that if a state considers itself as small, then it is small. Then we have behavior approach, which measures smallness in terms of a behavior of a state. Then we have relational approach, measuring smallness in relation to other states, and the residual approach, which sees the world in a black and white color and thinks that we have great states, big states, and then if you are not this great state, then you are a small state. As for the foreign policy behavior of a small state, mostly positivist-driven scholarship provides balance of power theory, which sees foreign policy behavior of a small state in terms of balancing or bandwagoning great powers. Then we have economic interdependence theory, which is informed by liberal theoretical approach and kind of argues that economic interdependence guarantees peaceful cohabitation for a small state, and democratic peace theory thinks that if a state is a democracy, liberal democracy, then it can live peacefully with other states of the international system. So to sum up, realists, neorealists, they define smallness in terms of lack of capabilities, and in this case, smallness equals to weakness. In this case, as I have said, small state follows the foreign policy of balancing or bandwagoning great powers. Then we have liberals and neoliberals who define smallness in terms of lack of capabilities, and in this case, smallness usually equals to weakness. And small states follow survival strategy by joining international organizations, and they commit to international law in order to survive. While constructivists, they define smallness in terms of self-perception and relations with others. And in this case, smallness does not always equal to weakness. Thus, there is no particular strategy that small states follow. If we talk about the literature that talks about foreign policy, there are certain ideas that we see most often. Scholars usually argue that small states exhibit a low level of participation in world affairs. They address a narrow scope of foreign policy issues. They limit their behavior to their immediate geographic arena. They employ diplomatic and economic foreign policy instruments as opposed to military ones. They emphasize internationalized principles or international law and other morally minded ideas, secure multinational agreements, and join multinational institutions whenever they can. They usually choose neutral positions, rely on superpowers, aim to cooperate and avoid conflicts, and they spend foreign policy resources on ensuring security and survival. However, when we go into details about the foreign policy of Georgia, we see that most of these trends we don't see in Georgian foreign policy behavior, which again builds the argument that it is an academic puzzle to the study of international relations. As for the literature that specifically covers Georgian foreign policy development, we see the differentiation of 4 stages based on different governments. And scholars usually argue that the first government of the independent Georgia, Gamsakhudia's administration, provided a failed stage to the Georgian foreign policy development due to the fact that it had inexperienced leader who was empowered by his worldview, and he couldn't deal with tense political situation in the country, specifically ethnic conflicts and civil war, plus some geopolitical reality limited the options for this particular stage. Then we have Shevardnadze's government. Shevardnadze was one of the Soviet leaders who then went back to Georgia and became a president. And scholars argue that this period was reactive and pragmatic and even hesitant foreign policy. They divide 2 stages within Shevardnadze's government, pre-1995, which they argue was bandwagoning Russia, and then post-1995, which was mostly focused on balancing Russia through achieving closer ties with the West. Later, Rose Revolution happened, Saakashvili's government came into power, and scholars argue that this is the period when Euro-Atlantic orientation was pursued in parallel of othering Russia. Some scholars call Saakashvili's foreign policy aggressive for pro-Westernism and argue that ideological dispositions dominated the balance of power calculations during this era. Some scholars also say that this was an attempt to escape from Russia's historic, geographic, and civilizational space. And finally, we have Georgian Dream government since 2013. And scholars see this period to be between rapprochement and confrontation with Russia, or in other words, strategic obscurantism, as some have put it. Mostly, many authors say that this is a pragmatic accommodation between Moscow and Tbilisi while remaining Euro-Atlantic ambitions. As for the determinants of Georgian foreign policy, there are 3 themes. Some scholars focus on external factors, and they say desire to remain credible in the eyes of the USA is what determines Georgian foreign policy, or relative power distribution in the international as well as regional systems, and geographic proximity of aggressive powers such as Russia. Some scholars focus on internal factors, namely political paternalism together with its national identity, as well as Georgia's choice to alienate Russia, which is explained by the assumed affinity with European state model rather than Russian way of development. Or another explanation could be ideas and identities of Georgian elite groups, which is defined as which defines Georgia as a European state, not a post-Soviet state, and thus they highlight the importance of modernization according to Western standards, or simply the desire of some political leaders to stay in power. And finally, the most common version is that mixed factors define Georgian foreign policy. Even though external security is the key shaping factor of general tendencies, particular strategies are built on unit level determinants, such as the capacity of Georgia as a state, as well as the degree of cohesion among elite groups. Or it could be regional environment plus weak statehood guided by one man leadership style. Um, or some authors believe that the combination of national interests, regional, domestic situations, civil and ethnic wars dictates the foreign policy of Georgia. And finally, the balance of power calculations plus national identity. So these are the main factors that are highlighted in the existing literature defining Georgian foreign policy. The main criticism towards realist arguments is their ahistorical reading. They cannot explain the observed changes under unchanged geopolitical conditions, and this particular stance can be questioned by pointing out the extent to which the West is willing to balance against Russia in Georgia's foreign policy game, if we call it. And the criticism towards constructivist stance would be the fact that it cannot explain the formation process of ideas and identities and lacks the consideration of masses, plus it takes Western superiority as given. So coming from this gap in the existing literature, I introduced post-colonialism as a well-equipped analytical lens, theoretical lens to explain Georgian foreign policy. But in order to do so, we have to deal with the definitions of colonialism and post-colonialism. And then before trying to fit post-colonial critique into the study of IR, we have to also justify its applicability to the post-Soviet space. Because as we all know, this theory was developed mainly to explain the current socio-political processes in the colonies of the West. So defining colonial and post-colonial is quite difficult. Sometimes colonialism is defined as the condition when a nation exploits another nation and considers its inhabitants as inferior beings. And in this sense, colony is a product of invasion and it is dependent on the possessing mother country. Post-colonialism can be a tool for examining the past and the critique of the cultural and ideological legacies of imperialism. It was used as a temporal marker before maybe beginning of 2000s, but right now it's more commonly used as a critical toolkit. Thus, it proves most useful when it locates a specifically anti or post-colonial discursive purchase in culture, one which begins when the colonizing power inscribes itself onto the body of space of its others, and which continues as an often occluded tradition into the modern theater of neo-colonialist international relations. So if we take this definition, then we can argue that colonialism and thus post-colonialism can be applied to the post-Soviet space. However, unfortunately, there is not much interaction between post-colonial studies on the one hand and post-Soviet studies on the other hand. And this issue has also been addressed by many scholars. And some of the arguments that come up to explain the lack of dialogue is that First of all, in many cases, area study scholars, they are not really acquainted with the social theory, so they don't know how to use it. And another factor could be that this theory is more suitable to study literature or some other fields, thus translating it into the international relations is kind of difficult. Another factor could be the fact that usually scholars from the post-Soviet space aren't really represented in leading universities, and thus we cannot consider these people to be a part of global discussion. Postcolonialism, with its focus on subjectivity, makes every postcoloniality situated and therefore different. And if we take this definition, then we can argue that it can be expanded to various regions. And when a nation state establishes itself as a ruler, impressing its own laws and systems of education and rearranging the mode of production for its own economic benefit, terms colonizer and colonized can be used. And this is the case in the Soviet Union. But I really like the approach when we focus on the relation of population to the authority of foreign domination rather than trying to fit one particular definition of postcolonialism to the post-Soviet space. We can say that the Soviet Union crafted political domination over geographically diverse territories and imposed its hierarchical culture, with Moscow at its center, over its ethnically diverse citizens. And some authors, due to this reason, call Soviet Union an empire of nations or affirmative action empire, which was characterized by aggressive centralization and the promotion of national cultures in the periphery. So in this sense, I think we can apply post-colonial critique to the post-Soviet space, but this should be done with certain considerations and limitations in mind. Of course, another issue is how to translate post-colonial toolkit to study international relations. And post-colonial critique has many advantages in this sense. It challenges the centrality of Europe as a historical source or origin of the international relations, and universality of legal and moral norms and the understanding of knowledge in general. Moreover, it acknowledges myriad varieties of oppression and exploitation and recognizes the multiplicity of identities and stating. It also examines how formerly colonized regions, their people, governments, societies experience international relations, and the effects and impacts of colonial rule and imperial history still play a great role in shaping the worldviews of the former colonies. So highlighting the concept of experience is what is the main strength of introducing post-colonial critique to the study of IR. And by doing so, we can explain why normative ideals are constructed that holds together the identity rather than taking superiority of certain norms for granted. Another topic of discussions is who was colonized, because as we know, Soviet Union was stretched from Asia to Europe, and it covered many countries with different histories, with different cultures, and thus the Soviet Union was also experienced in different ways in these states. Some authors try to look at the Russian Empire as well and argue that maybe we have the case of double coloniality in the post-Soviet states. For example, Adams differentiates two groups before 1917. People whose religion and cultures and historical traditions are not much distinguishable from Russian one. For example, Ukraine, Belarus, Baltic states, Moldova, Armenia, Georgia, Poland, Finland, which are not considered as colonies. And then we have colonialized states like Siberia, Muslim territories of Central Asia, Volga, Urals, Caucasus, Crimea. So these territories, they were conquered by force or arms, and then they were administered by military governments. and they were historically and culturally different from Russia. That's why they are considered as colonies, unlike the previous group of states. As for the Soviet type of colonization, Moore, for example, differentiates three groups: classic colonies, then we have the group of colonies where colonizers settle and they turn the indigenous populations into forced work. And finally, we have standard or dynastic type of colonization. They try to present Caucasus and Central Asia as classic type of colonies, and then settler type of colonized regions. We have Latvia and Kazakhstan, and finally standard or dynastic type of colonialism we see in Ukraine or Belarus. As opposed to this view, Kerry and Ratsiborsky, they have divided and provided three different classifications. In their case, classical colonies are Central Asian countries, and here main criteria would be foreign control, foreign settlers, cultural and linguistic gap, as well as immigrants and dependent economy. Then we have inner colonies, which are Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Belarus, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Ukraine. And main criteria here it is that people were marginalized, but also more transformed than Central Asia. And aside from Belarus and some parts of Ukraine, they were characterized by strong guardianship of their independence and cultural and linguistic differences. And finally, we have arguable or semi-colonies that includes Central and Eastern European nations, which managed to achieve some autonomy and civil society that was resisting colonialism. So this would conclude the chapter talking about post-colonialism. And now to apply what we have here to the case of Georgia, I deliver this chapter, Ambivalent State of Mind, where I introduce very shortly Georgian recorded history, and then how this history is remembered, what is remembered exactly, what is forgotten, and then why, what kind of situation we have in Georgian socio-historical context. I will not talk in detail about Georgian history, but it is an ancient nation, and tracking Georgian history starts from the 4th century BC, when the creation of Georgian script took place, and this was a crucial event in the history of Georgian nationhood. Then in the 4th century, Georgia became Christian, and this is also one of the factors that still plays a major role in country's socio-political life. After that, we had rivalries between different non-Christian civilizations over Georgia, Iranian conquest, Arab conquest, then we had Seljuks, as well as Mongols, Ottoman Empire. Georgia has been divided between different civilizations for many centuries, but in the 18th century, it entered Russian protectorate by the Treaty of Georgievsk, and this is when very complicated relationship between Russia and Georgia takes place and takes start. This treaty was followed by the incorporation of Georgia to the Russian protectorate, to the Tsarist Russia, and this was followed by the Russification policies. However, there was a resistance against Russian rule throughout these years, which made national liberation movements very active in Georgia. And finally, they achieved to create an independent democratic republic of Georgia in 1918. Unfortunately, this republic only lived for 3 years, from 1918 to 1921, but it did manage to acquire recognition from Moscow, as well as many other countries, including Japan, interestingly. This is also the period when cultural and territorial autonomies were divided or like given to Abkhazia, Ajaria, and Zakatala. These are the territories located in Georgia, and some of the resistant groups in Abkhazia and South Ossetia were also formed during this time. Then in 1921, Georgia became part of the Soviet Union, but this was not a voluntary decision. It was occupied by the Soviet army, and Abkhazia and Acharia were made as autonomous Soviet socialist republics, while South Ossetia was made an autonomous oblast during this stage. However, Soviet rule is also characterized by Georgian resistance. There were several protests in the country in 1924, then in 1956, then in 1978, 1989. There were so many protests basically trying to remain their national consciousness and oppose anything that would endanger Georgian national values. And finally, we have independent Georgia since 1991, which experienced four governments till this point: Gamsakhourdia leadership, Shevardnadze leadership, Saakashvili leadership, and finally we have Georgian Dream government. But what is interesting is that even though what I talked about, this is universally agreed, more or less universally agreed recorded history of Georgia, the understanding of it and the commemoration of it is very different and kind of problematic in Georgian modern Georgian society. And to simplify the task of portraying the ambivalence, I followed Bodner's definitions of official and vernacular memories. Bodner defines official memory as an institutionalized way of commemoration, while vernacular memory refers to the ways people remember and recollect their past experiences. And in Georgia, we see that there is a tendency to homogenize the national narrative by specific political figures, making parts of the society neglected and even left out and marginalized. Moreover, the mixed feelings regarding the past are also present in vernacular commemoration, further separating the layers of the society in terms of their age, socio-political background, geographic location, or ethnicity. And one of the problematic aspects is the issue of Stalin, or how he is remembered in Georgian society. And in my book, I have referred to many research articles that deal with this problem. It's interesting because some people do not necessarily feel nostalgic towards the Soviet Union, but they still have positive attitude towards Stalin. And even in the official narrative where we see the demonization of the Soviet Union, it's interesting that officials still decide to keep the Museum of Stalin, which kind of contradicts the existence of another museum, which is the Museum of Soviet Occupation. So we have this mixed feelings and hybrid commemoration of the past, and a very clear situation when there is a need for the negotiation of the past and coming up with the shared knowledge and shared remembrance of the common past. Another issue that divides Georgian society is how Georgian conflicts are talked about. We have to say that when it comes to Georgian conflicts, official narrative internationalizes this problem and sees the conflicts to be between Georgia on the one hand and Russia on the other hand. So we don't see Abkhazians and South Ossetians as parties of the conflict at all, and thus their voices aren't heard many times. And this is due to the fact that even the narration of conflicts is very different and competing and even conflicting in some cases. For example, Georgian historians, they highlight the fact that these territories are Georgian, that Abkhazians and South Ossetians are newcomers, they are a little backward than Georgians, and usually historical notes characterize these people with negative qualities. While on the contrary, Ossetian and Abkhazian scholars, they try to prove that they have the right to be autochthonous population of those regions, and then they even claim that they're the ones who brought higher culture to the region rather than Georgians themselves. So this kind of hybridity creates some ambivalent state of mind in the modern Georgian society, and this is reflected in every field of social life, including foreign policy of Georgia. So to come back to my research questions and research argument, in chapters 5 and 6, I develop an argument claiming that Georgian foreign policy evolution is the pursuit to become normal. And there were 2 chapters on this path. First of all, we had chapter when Georgian foreign policy tried to come to terms with its post-coloniality. And within this chapter, we have 2 stages: Great Delusion, which was led by Gamsakurde, and post-independence agony led by Shevardnadze. And next chapter would be towards becoming normal, where we have Saakashvili's aggressive turn and current stage of being deadlocked in predefined conditionalities. So the first stage was characterized by strong resistant and repulsed attitudes towards Russia, while Shevardnadze tried to combine both resistant and collaborative spirit, both attracted and repulsed sentiments. Then during Saakashvili's era, we saw very aggressive switch from collaborative to resistant attitude and a very strong repulsion towards Russia. And finally, current stage is collaborative, but at the same time, the repulsion that was inherently transmitted to this stage from the previous government is still here. And I argue that it's very difficult and unlikely to change this sentiment, which is so deeply fixed in Georgian political discourse and even society. So discursive construction of identities was done through post-colonial sentiments. And here I define sentiment as a long-term disposition that is evoked by the encounter with a specific entity, person, or topic. And in this case, sentimentalization of the self accounts for the observed continuities, while the sentimentalization of the others and positioning of the self vis-a-vis the others account for the observed changes in Georgian foreign policy. To zoom on specific stages, during Gamsakhurdya's Great Delusion, the continuity of Georgian self was presented based on history, culture, and religion, although it was claimed that during the entire period of Georgian statehood, we had some interruptions by force, and usually this power that interrupted Georgian nationhood was Russia. Thus, Georgia is presented as a victim and survivor at the same time, while continuity of Russian other from Tsarist Russia, then Soviet Union, and current stage of Russian Federation is done so that it's represented as an evil, backward, ideological, and physical threat, or even colonizer to Georgia. In this discourse, the West represents a source for legitimization. It's civilized and it's superior to Russia, while Georgia's glorification is further stressed, and it's claimed that Georgia is a special country with a spiritual mission to enlighten the world, and anti-Russian sentiments are the ones that dictate Georgian foreign policy during Gamsakhurdya's Great Delusion. Then we have Shevardnadze's post-independence agony, which is characterized by hybridity. Georgian self is still presented based on history, culture, religion. It's still portrayed as a victim and a survivor. Plus, we see a new angle presenting Georgia as geopolitically important country, which has the potential to be a regional leader. The understanding of Russian other is quite vague. It's helping hand and friend on the one hand, and then threat and instigator of conflicts on the other. And this is done at the same time. The West here is a partner based on common values. However, it's stressed that the West is not interested enough in Georgian issue. Thus, we see hope and disappointment towards the West. during this era. And finally, we can say that this is the period of ambiguous and very inconsistent foreign policy that is characterized with mixed sentiments regarding Russia as well as Georgian Self and the West. During Saakashvili's government, coming to Saakashvili's government, the Self is presented as an inseparable part of Europe, still a victim and a survivor. However, now we see Georgia positioned as a development model for the entire Soviet space, post-Soviet space. Russia, on the other hand, is presented as a barrier between Georgia and the world, an enemy backward, and there is a need for Russia to be transformed in the minds of Georgian foreign policy makers. While the Western other is portrayed in a positive light based on common values, interests, identities. However, we still have hope and disappointment regarding West in this case, and Georgia's spiritual mission during Saakashvili's era becomes overcoming complexes and transforming the post-Soviet space. While the current Georgian Dream government, which is deadlocked in predefined conditionalities, presents Georgian Self based on history, culture, European identity, while Russian other would be potential partner and the threat at the same time, Western other would be family for Georgia and the main partner. And in this particular stage, pro-Western foreign policy is still further highlighted as the main direction for the country. However, this is combined by the collaborative spirit towards Russia, making Georgia's only mission to be transformed from a post-Soviet country to a normal European state. To conclude my findings, I argue that there are three main sentiments that have been employed to construct Georgian foreign policy. First one is nativism, second one is hybridity, and finally compensatory tag. Nativism in the context of post-colonialism is defined as a state of romanticizing one's own culture and overpraising the pre-colonial times. Colonial experiences, however, do not bear full responsibility over post-colonial discourses, and pre-colonial times are very often presented through the lens of colonial experiences. And to apply this to the case of Georgian foreign policy, we can say that Georgian foreign policy evolution illustrates this strong nativist sentiments. And this particular fact is the main argument why Georgia dares and is brave enough to breach the geopolitical calculations and follow sentiment-driven foreign policy. While hybridity is defined as biological condition by some authors, however, in this context, it refers to a psychological condition and the ways of commemoration. And intellectual hybridity or the in-betweenness creates an ambivalent understanding of colonial past and Russia as a colonial power in this particular case study. We see that the suppression of hybridity by Georgian officials leads to homogenization of anti-Russian sentiments. And I argue that the negligence of the existing hybridity is resulted in creation of a single narrative justifying the anti-Russian foreign policy and even stigmatizing any other alternative option. Finally, compensatory tag behavior is introduced by Moore, and the concept explains that if in former colonies of Europe, the compensatory behavior is reflected in mimicking the colonizer, in the post-Soviet space, the post-colonial desire fixates on the glittering Euro-American MTV and Coca-Cola biz that broke it. And we see this dynamic in Georgian foreign policy very clearly. The concept of compensatory tag explains how Georgian foreign policymakers are fixated on rejoining the European family and becoming one with the West. Thus, these three sentiments together define Georgian foreign policy, which I argue to be the politics of post-colonial subjectivity. To see where my research fits in the broader body of knowledge, I put this table on, and we can see that if realism sees Georgian foreign policy shifts in terms of balancing bandwagoning Russia, and constructivism argues that it's the way towards European family. In case of post-colonialism, this would be the post-colonial quest towards becoming normal, while determining factors in case of realism would be changes and continuities in geopolitical circumstances. In case of constructivism, it would be change in the identities and the ideas of elite groups, while post-colonialism argues that it's nativism, hybridity, and compensatory tag behavior altogether that define Georgian foreign policy. And driving force in this case would be post-colonial subjectivity, unlike constructivist case, where its ideas and identities and compatibility of social orders, or realist arguments, which explains this by geopolitics and power balance calculations. To conclude my findings, we can say that the study contributes to the field of IR by providing a historical reading to the foreign policy of Georgia and highlighting the role of sentiments in its construction. The findings underline the shortcomings of the mainstream IR theories by pointing out their Western-centric ahistorical nature and questioning the supremacy of Western ideals. The politics of postcolonial subjectivity that was developed in this book, in this study, as an analytical tool can be used to analyze foreign policies of other states and other post-Soviet states, particularly explaining different foreign policy trajectories, even for the countries sharing the same historical experiences, because subjectivity of understanding is the key concept that this analytical tool relies on. The study, however, is limited by focusing on the official leading narratives produced by the state leadership, and it can be furthered and expanded by covering all the competing narratives existing in a wider political discourse. Because even if we see the trends that I talked about as an official Georgian stance, we have to admit that there is a diversity of opinions and diversity of positions within Georgian society, as well as within Georgian political spectrum. And in order to provide a much more wider and much more wider explanation, it's important to cover all the ideas coming from any parts of this political spectrum. So this was my presentation for today. Thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions, reflections, comments, please feel free to share.
Okay, Mariam, thank you very much for this insightful and very rich presentation. I really like the fact that you both placed that subject matter into the theoretical discussion and methodological sort of observations, as well as then connected to the empirical findings. Just to sort of provide certain summary to those who sort of seek really the answer to the question that Mariam was seeking to answer. So as we've just observed, Georgia went through different historical periods with different political leaders, and very drastic change of the rhetoric. Nevertheless, throughout this period of time, Russia has continued to play the role of the other, and this has been played in different ways by different governments. However, this was done to emphasize that Georgia is very different from Russia, and this is the point that that Mariam has made in the early presentation. To answer the question of what Georgia's normal sort of state is, as it appears from this presentation, this normalcy is related to Georgia becoming the European state. However, what European is, or the definition of what it means to be European, is not really the focus of these discourses. Rather, it is the contrasting of what Russia is, and how Georgia is not Russia. And I really like this point about how the difference with Russia is emphasized. However, domestic divisions are sort of silenced in a way to provide this cohesiveness of the coverage. But by itself, this actually calls for the analysis, and I think that that was another excellent point. Now, let me invite the questions from the floor so that we can have a wider discussion. You can either ask questions personally, or leave them in the chat box. Then I will just read them out. Any questions from the floor? Now, Mariam, as we are waiting for the questions, let me just ask you a few clarifying questions. One is that, I really like this, point about Russia playing other, even historically, in the 20th century. But as you went through the sort of coverage of the history of Georgia, we realized that Ottoman Empire was one that at times has been, considered other, and then disappeared, or is not anymore featuring as other. I'm just wondering, if not for Russia, even in historical perspective, what other we can see in in analyzing the nature of a Georgian state. I'm just wondering if hypothetically we imagine that there is no Russia tomorrow, what would be other in a negative way, in a sense, for Georgia?
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a good question. And even today, I think there is Russia, which is understood in a hybrid way, based on the fact that if it's seen as a colonizer, it's definitely a negative power within the Georgian context. But on the other hand, the fact that we see the common religion between Georgia and Russia is sometimes referred to as an argument portraying Russia in a positive light. So as long as we share the religion, it's okay. But then because Russia played such a negative role within Georgia during so many centuries, the fact that it has same religion is kind of devalued. So if there was no Russia, I think the fact that Georgia is Christian country surrounded by many non-Christian powers would be highlighted, because this was done like that throughout many centuries. Before Russia, Georgia was defined by the fact that it is a Christian country, and therefore its survival was based by the idea that it had to remain as such. So I think maybe Turkey or any other power that doesn't share the value of Christian faith could be the one becoming other in Georgian case. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. This is very interesting. Now I see the hand. Kamila Smagulova, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, hello, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Camila. I'm a researcher from Kazakhstan. Mariam, thanks a lot for your presentation. That was very insightful. And my question is related to the influence or potential correlation of current foreign policy trajectory of Georgia and its civil society. So considering the fact that it seems that the majority of civil society is still like oriented of, I don't know, pro-EU integration and democratic values and remains very active, which is a little bit of a paradox considering the government being pro-Russian, right? And having, I don't know, Ivanishvili and his influence to the country. To what extent do you see that, like the fact that Georgian government is, I don't know, officially or unofficially having this Russian trajectories, would this, do you think, influence the dynamic of civil society in the long term or in the short term? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a very nice question and very logical one. But my perspective would be that nothing can change anti-Russian sentiment at this point. And if government decides to stress on their pro-Russian stance, I think they can lose their legitimacy, and then they can lose their power. This is why they don't do it directly. They don't do it overtly, even though they try. They are very limited in their maneuverability, because there is such a strong pro-Western sentiment within Georgian society. It's almost like a religion. It's unquestioned. And at this point, I don't see Georgian government becoming more pro-Russian or more vocally pro-Russian, rather than I think civil society is more powerful in this case. So if Georgian government tries to go against it very directly, they will lose power. This is my perspective. I don't think the other way is possible. I don't think that pro-Russian sentiments can somehow become more widespread in Georgian society or even civil society, rather than other way around.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Koizumi-san, go ahead.
Do you think mic okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, okay. Thank you very much. Your presentation, interesting presentation. My name is Koizumi Masayuki Koizumi, graduate Tsukuba University. And my question is, my research field is Central Asia. In Central Asia, countries countries, each other's relations had been not good, but Central Asian countries sharing, we are independent. We are independent countries in Central Asia. I think. My question is, how about Georgia? Georgia in Caucasus, not relations, Russians and post-Soviets watching. How about Georgia? Does Georgia have identity in independence? Independence in Caucasus countries. My questions.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, very interesting point, because yes, Georgia currently tries to distance itself from being associated with Caucasus region for maybe understandable reasons, because it's characterized by conflicts, by instability, and so on. So what Georgia is trying right now is to be seen as part of the Eastern European country rather than Caucasian or post-Soviet. So it's trying to present itself as an Eastern European country that strives towards European integration with the NATO, and this is the political discourse. Not independent, of course independent, but if we have to categorize within the geopolitical or like regional context, I think Georgia prefers to be seen as a Black Sea neighboring country, BSEC country, or Eastern European rather than post-Soviet or Caucasian or any other regional affiliation. Yeah, I hope that.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me read out.
Thank you very much.
Let me read out the question from Shioi Sensei. Thank you very much for your talk. I have a question regarding the change of evaluation for the Georgievsk Treaty in 1783. It has long been regarded as a starting point of Russian colonialism on the one hand. On the other, a foundation of Russo-Georgian friendship relations in modern times. How do you do contemporary Georgian scholars and journalists evaluate this treaty? Can we see any drastical change in their evaluation?
Well, I can say what is public discourse. Like recently, I think several months ago, maybe one of the famous Georgian academic person from academia, scholar, he made a point or comment about Georgievsk Treaty and called it as the disaster, something that put country in a very bad position. And he was criticized a lot by many people. However, he also had some supporters. So this issue, as long as I see, as long as I know, is also part of the greater discussion. So we have people who are sympathizing with the decision of King Erekle II, who made this treaty based on the fact that he had no other option. He had to remain Christian. Thus, Russia was the only Christian power providing this support and safety, while others, they criticize this decision and say that this put Georgia in a very bad position, and the fact that Georgia has a very complicated relationship with Russia, the fact that there was a war, the fact that we cannot free ourselves from Russia is because of the Treaty of Georgievsk. So I would say Georgian scholarly literature, as well as journalists, as well as public opinion is divided with this regarding this issue, as well as many other aspects of the history. It's not much different, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we have only a few minutes left. If there are pressing questions, I would like to invite now everyone to ask. However, there's one point that I wanted to clarify. So you suggested that pro-Western, orientation of Georgia is almost religiously accepted within, both society and political elites. Do you see this as a problem in the sense that although it now serves as a positive sort of identity construction in a way, it can in time also serve as a sort of something that could become a negative other, similar to Russia. And so the next sort of related question is, I understand that one sort of facet of identity is oriented towards the external, towards the foreign other. But you also mentioned that there is very little attempt to construct domestic identity, which is more inclusive in respect to the regions. I'm just wondering, do you see this as a problem also of a kind that can, in the future, serve as a point of, discontent within political elites, but also public, perhaps?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I definitely think that is a problem because, first of all, it can be an explosive element in hands of nationalistic political leaders who can use this issue for their own benefits rather than the benefit of the country. Plus, even the approach towards the West is not that straightforward or very black and white. We sometimes see that when political leaders address to domestic audiences, they highlight the fact that even though West is also other, being with the West does not endanger national values. So in this sense, we see the differentiation between the West and self, but West is not necessarily understood as a threat. I think that anything that is taken for granted, that is taken as a religion, unquestioned, would probably create some kind of issue. I am pro opening the discussions, and I think that negotiating everything would be better for the country in general. Thus, if we have the hybridity of opinions within the society and we decide not to listen to some people because we don't like their opinions, this would potentially in long term create much more resistance, and we don't know how it will play out, because even now there are so many nationalistic political leaders and nationalistic parties within Georgian political spectrum, and we see the tendency of those ideas gaining more and more power and more popularity within Georgia. So yeah, definitely there is a need to negotiate everything, the past, the present, the future. And right now we don't see the discussions going on that much.
Okay, thank you very much, Mariam, for this excellent presentation, and we're very much looking forward to this book to be published, so that we have a wider sort of audience of scholars and practitioners to go through this and inform themselves about their perceptions of Georgia, but also post-Soviet space. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank everyone else who participated in this. We'll stop here for today. And we'll please follow us on our social media sites for further information on future talks. Thank you very much and have a good day.